Alrighty, today we're going to take a look at one of the most famous figures in world history. Everyone's favorite short guy, Napoleon. And we're going to check out how he came to power, what he did as Emperor of France, and ultimately how he ended up being overthrown. Let's go back to the end of the Reign of Terror with the death of Robespierre. At that point, they disbanded the National Convention as it was, and they recreated a new government called the Directory. The Directory was established in 1795 and consisted of 5 members that were known as directors. They were elected by the legislature, which now consisted of 2 houses, the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500. This is a lot like our Congress has the U.S. House of Representatives, and it has the Senate. The purpose of the Directory was just to bring France back to stability. At this point, after all the violence and all the death and all the chaos and the wars and the drafts and the starvation and the unemployment and the homelessness, people just wanted to go back to normal. They wanted a stable society again. And so ultimately, that was the directive for the Directory, if you will. The Directory had a lot of challenges that it needed to deal with. There was still economic stability with rising prices. There was a weak economy. And ultimately, there was widespread poverty. So they've got to fix that. They also have to fix the political unrest. You still have royalists who want to return to a king, and you have Jacobins who are completely opposed to a king. And this is a constant threat to the government's authority because they are being attacked from both sides, in essence, or pressured from both sides to do completely opposite things. And then finally, France is still at war. These coalition armies that are trying to contain the French Revolution, well, guess what? They're still out there, and they are plaguing France, and they're draining its resources and draining its manpower. So lots of stuff going against the Directory from the get-go. So what did they do? Well, they did a couple of things. They implemented financial reforms, a new tax system, some currency reform, and what they were trying to do was drive the prices down and ultimately stabilize the economy, bring enough money into the government that it could pay off its debt, and they were fairly successful at doing that. They were trying to wage a war, so they launched foreign military campaigns. And a lot of that was honestly to divert attention from the conditions at home in France. If you have everyone concentrated on other countries and the threat to your country, you don't tend to look nearly as closely at what's happening inside the country. And then finally, the government is going to actually use force to try and suppress both the royalist and the radical Republican opposition. That is not always going to go well for the Directory, and the Directory overall is going to struggle to get any kind of confidence from the people. The Directory was not a popular government because no matter what it did, it couldn't answer the questions the country needed answered. It couldn't fix those problems the way they needed to be fixed. And ultimately, people don't have a lot of confidence in that ruling executive council of the Directory. Now, Napoleon is, at this point, going to be a key figure in the revolution. And so we need to talk about him. Napoleon was actually born in Corsica, which is an island in the Mediterranean Sea, about mid-shin of Italy. And in 1769, Corsica is conquered by France. So initially, Napoleon is a huge Corsican nationalist who does not want French control. But upon joining the army, he is going to become an artillery officer. He's going to start to lose his sense of Corsican nationalism, and it is going to be replaced by an identity tied to the French country, not to his homeland. Ironically, Napoleon was eager to join the Navy, but they said he was too young, so he had to go to the Army where he joined the military. Captain Napoleon Bonaparte actually came on the scene in an incident that you're familiar with. He is the one who was ordered down to put down the Parisian mob storming the Tuileries Palace during the August insurrection. Napoleon actually ordered the troops to fire into the crowd, and the crowd quickly dispersed after that. So, even at an early age, at a younger or a lesser rank, he is showing decisive leadership, and he is able to make those decisions that are hard to make. He is famous because he has joined the Jacobin Club and supports the revolutionary ideas or the Enlightenment ideas of the revolution. But he also is famous because he is the commander of a small army that drove the British from the port of Toulon. He defeated Austria, forcing them to seek peace and knocking them out of the coalition army. And ultimately, he was named commander of a small, ill-equipped army in northern Italy, and yet somehow managed to secure the entire region for France. Now, the one thing you want to keep in mind about Napoleon is this. Napoleon is a politician as well as a military official. He carried around a PR team, a public relations team with him to write articles about him, to get his name in the papers in France, to craft a certain image that he wanted crafted of himself. So the hard part in history is sorting out what was propaganda Napoleon put out about himself from what is historically accurate. We do know that after gaining control of northern Italy, he was sent to Egypt to cut off the British supply lines to India, and he did a great job there fighting against the British in Egypt, ultimately securing victories, fighting in front of the Great Sphinx that I'm sure you've all seen pictures of in Egypt. And that is where his military career is really starting to take off. His name is known to people back home in France. He is considered a good commander. Success seems to follow him. After returning from Egypt, he is going to be celebrated as a hero. But it is worth pointing out that Napoleon, realizing the instability at home in France, chooses to, in essence, abandon his 13,000 soldiers in Syria, and he's going to decide to head back to France to pursue more political ends. So he is made out to look like his time in Egypt was a big, huge success, but in reality, his troops were at a deadlock with the enemy, the stalemate, and he had won the victories he could, and it looked like he was just going to be stuck in a kind of quagmire of fighting in Egypt, and that's why he decided to leave. So France is again at war, this time with Austria, Britain, and Russia, and there's a civil war between the Royalists and the Jacobins taking place. The government's in disarray, and ultimately Napoleon calls the Directory nothing but a bunch of lawyers, which is definitely not a compliment in this particular situation. He's going to conspire with the chief theorist of the French Revolution, Abbé Sieyès, and other politicians who realize the Directory is too weak to do what needs to be done to restore stability to the country. And ultimately, he's going to stage a coup in which the Directory is overthrown and it is replaced by a consulate in which Napoleon is the first consul of three. The first consul is the most important member of the consulate that is going to run this new government. All of this happens in what is called the coup of 18 Brumaire, which is a month on the French calendar. We call it November. And November 9th and 10th, he and his allies execute a successful coup, and they do replace this directory with a French consulate. The big part here is Napoleon at this point still has no credible authority. He wasn't elected, he wasn't appointed by anybody. He, in essence, has literally staged a coup in which he took power. And because of that, he is going to lead the drive for a new constitution to be written, in which the first consul is given greater power and the co-consuls become advisory in nature only. He is also going to have his consulate approved by a plebiscite. A plebiscite is a popular vote of the people. And ultimately, this is what is going to give him the legitimacy he needs as ruler. And we can see that here on the importance of this plebiscite vote. The plebiscite basically gave Napoleon the ability to say he had been democratically approved as first consul. And that was crucial for him when it came to consolidating his position with the after the coup. The plebiscite is also going to ratify the new constitution, which established the consulate of which he is a part, and it concentrated power in Napoleon. Napoleon is often going to use the plebiscite tool throughout his conquering of different countries in Europe. He is going to create an illusion of popular support, but honestly, he is ruling as an authoritarian dictator. And he's got the veneer or the gloss of being democratically approved through these plebiscites. But no one was under any illusion. Napoleon was in charge, completely in charge. You see here that Napoleon ultimately is going to do away with the other co-consuls, and he decides that he wants to be named Emperor of France, which is obviously a massive step up from first consul. He goes to the Pope and he asks the Pope, hey, I want you to come and crown me in the Palace of Versailles. And this would be the first time in 1,000 years a Pope had crowned the French Emperor. The Pope at the time was Pope Pius the Eighth, and he agreed to attend after Napoleon promised to return control of parts of northern Italy to the Pope. So the Pope is going to come. He's going to show that he has authority over the French Emperor by crowning him. And Napoleon is aware that this is how the ceremony is supposed to go. The Pope is supposed to crown him and thus show all Catholics in the country that the Pope is behind Napoleon as Emperor of France. However, the day of the coronation, which you see pictured here, it's going to take a little different turn. He is standing there, and as the Pope walks up to him with the crown of the Emperor of France, he's about to place it on Napoleon's head when Napoleon literally grabs the crown out of the Pope's hand and places it on his own head. He also calls his wife Josephine over, and he sets the crown upon her. So what he's signifying here is that he is not beholding to the Catholic Church, that he is the ruler of the country, and he will rule independent of any religious organization, including the church. But at the same time, we know that he's had the blessing of the Pope because the Pope is present and was going to crown him. So Napoleon is emphasizing he's a self-made man, he's independent of all religious authority, etc. Now, if you notice in this painting, it was actually painted by Jacques-Louis David in French, one of Napoleon's personal painters, and he captured the scene in this massive painting that is actually 20 feet by 30 feet in dimension. Today, you can see this painting in the Louvre if you visit Paris. Jacques-Louis David was making sure that he posed all the figures so they are directly looking at Napoleon. He made the interior of the Notre Dame Cathedral look smaller so that the figures, especially that of Napoleon, would appear to have a greater stature. And you can see that Napoleon appears to be not only the center of attention, but he appears larger than life compared to the other people in the painting. He made sure Empress Josephine looked younger than she was at the time of the coronation, and he decided to show Napoleon crowning his empress because Jacques-Louis David believed that it made Napoleon appear nobler and less authoritarian. So ultimately, this painting is a bit of propaganda, again from the PR team that Napoleon surrounded himself with at all times. All right, so what did Napoleon do within France? That's the question. And I want to point out, Napoleon, this is not a guy to rest on his laurels. This is a guy who works hard and earns his position, earns his expertise, and earns what he is given and what he takes. Napoleon was known to work 16 hours a day as first consul, and the Council of State, which served as his advisors, he expected them to have the same kind of stamina and zeal for the job of fixing France as he did. One night, they were having a meeting, and the meeting had run into like 2 in the morning. And some of the counselors from the Council of State began to doze off. And he threw his fist down, and he screamed, "Do let's wake up, citizens. It's only 2 o'clock. We must earn our salaries." And that is kind of the superhuman kind of effort that Napoleon expected of himself, and he expected of those who served him. This was much applauded by his admirers, and one court official was actually overheard saying, "God made Bonaparte and then rested the 7th day." A royalist commented, "God should have rested a little earlier." Obviously, this is a joke of the time where the royalist who doesn't like Napoleon because they want a king is wishing Napoleon had never gotten to the position he was in. Napoleon is going to do several things, the most important of which, and the longest lasting legacy of Napoleon, is the implementation of a set of laws called the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code was a set of laws that stressed order over individual rights, and it completely remade the French legal system. It was based on Enlightenment principles. It was based on equality of all citizens. It was based on religious toleration. He is also going to bring back the Catholic religion as the official state religion, but he's going to ensure religious toleration of any religion. And also, it is based on the idea of meritocracy, where your advancement is based on ability, not your name, not what family you were born into, not how rich you are, but how much expertise you show in a certain area. These laws are going to rework the legal framework of all of Europe. They're going to be applied to all the territories that come under Napoleon's control. And they're going to replace all these strange independent laws and traditions and common law that had existed throughout France for centuries. Most of these laws are going to codify things of necessity. They're going to make law based purely on reason and common sense, not just on the arbitrary nature of some monarch. So Napoleon believes in this law, this Napoleonic Code. Today, the Napoleonic Code is the basis of law in over 40 countries around the world. So when I say that the Napoleonic Code, this set of laws, was his longest lasting legacy, he remade the legal framework of all of Europe. And there are still some 40 countries out there whose legal systems are based on the principles installed by Napoleon in his Napoleonic Code. In addition to the Napoleonic Code, he's going to restore France's finances. He actually establishes a Bank of France, which introduces a stable currency put out by his government. He implemented a centralized tax system. He is going to implement price controls. He's going to encourage new industry. He's going to tax everyone equally, not just the third estate. He's going to build roads and canals to aid business and the movement of goods and services. And ultimately, for the first time since before the French Revolution, the French economy is in a good spot. So Napoleon, again, not only a military leader, but actually a good governor of the country of France as well. He is going to overhaul the education system. Napoleon believes that if he's going to have good officials for the government, he needs to have a good education system to train people. And so he completely remakes the French education system, and he creates a network of state-run secondary schools that eventually expand access to universities. What this is doing is ensuring he's got a skilled workforce and he's got a skilled government officials to support the ambitious plans he has for France. So again, we see this idea of meritocracy with Napoleon. He doesn't want people that just have the right name. He wants people that are intelligent. He wants people that are well trained. He wants people that will work as hard as he can for the people of France. Napoleon's foreign policy was kind of a mixed bag. He is going to try and form some strategic alliances and treaties. He's going to obviously expand the French influence by conquest, and at one point is in charge or in command of the majority of Europe at that time. So we know those are good things for France. It is increasing the prestige of France. It's increasing the power base of France. It's increasing the amount of territory and resources that France controls. So the empire is growing. One thing he did, though, because of his hatred for Britain, Napoleon looked at Britain as his great white whale. He looked at it as his arch enemy. And he believed that if he could take Great Britain, that the rest of Europe would fall at his feet easily. Well, he did try an invasion of Great Britain using a massive French fleet carrying soldiers. Those soldiers and those ships were cut off by the British Navy in the English Channel, and a massive battle occurred called the Battle of Trafalgar, in which Admiral Horatio Nelson, with a quicker, better trained, more impressive British Navy, is able to sink many of the ships that were bound on invasion. Ultimately, the invasion fails. Napoleon has to call it off. But Napoleon is still dead set on weakening Great Britain, and then he's going to attack it in its weakened state. So how's he going to weaken it? Well, he's going to implement something called the Continental System. The Continental System is an embargo in which his design is to get every other country in Europe to stop trading with Great Britain, to use the French Navy to keep ships from coming and going into the island of Great Britain. And as you know, the island of Great Britain is an island. And so without outside supplies coming in, without outside resources coming in, they are not going to be able to survive and sustain for long. So his idea is cut off access to Great Britain through trade, make sure no goods get into the country, and as the country weakens, he will then invade the country and take control of it. Russia is going to be the fly in the ointment for the Continental System. Russia initially participated in the Continental System, but it backed out when Russia's economy began to tank. Russia and all these other European countries were very good trade partners with Great Britain, and when you cut off that trade, you cut off a lot of shipping, you cut off sailors, you cut off rope makers, you cut off blacksmiths, you cut off all these other employment positions that are all based around trade and shipping. And this is causing the economy of these European countries to fall apart. The one that bucks the system is Russia. Russia says, you know what, I'm out. I'm not doing it. You guys can do what you want. And ultimately, Because of Russia's lack of participation and because Britain was able to find alternative sources and markets for its goods outside of Europe, and because they were able to defy the embargo and get ships in and out with the strength of the British Navy guarding them, ultimately the continental system is going to prove to be an absolute failure. And it is one of the few failures that Napoleon ends up committing during his time as emperor. On the more positive side, military battles and achievements are going to build up over the course of his time in office as Emperor of France. This is just a list of some of the key battles that took place. You'll notice they're fighting Austria, they're fighting Russia, they're fighting Austria again. All of this is going to lead to peace treaties designed to keep the French country and the French territories safe and free of invasion from other people. Napoleon had a way of consolidating power in every country he took over. He knew that you can't just take over a country and then leave it and go take over another country, because that country that you left behind, it may well rise up in rebellion because they don't want to be ruled by a foreign country. And so what he did is he would remove any of the monarchs on the throne in the countries he conquered, and he would replace them with close friends and relatives of his that he knew were loyal to them. He's going to incorporate the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Germany into the Grand Empire of France. He's going to destroy the Holy Roman Empire. He's going to cut Prussia in half, and he's going to defeat Spain and place his brother on the throne of Spain. So by the year 1812, he controls most of Europe, and French nationalism is at an all-time high because Napoleon has been so successful militarily. He has come to believe that he and his army can conquer anyone. They can do anything, and the French people believe that as well. So they are getting to the point where they have great pride in France, great pride in their military, great pride in their empire, great pride in this new Napoleonic code, great pride in their bustling economy that is now starting to take off. So Napoleon is clicking on all cylinders moving into the year 1812. I've told you before that it seems like in every great leader's progression, that at some point they make a fatal flaw. Napoleon's fatal flaw is his invasion of Russia as punishment for the fact they refused to join the continental system. He's still mad at that, and he blames Russia for the continental system's failure. And so ultimately, he is going to turn his sights on Russia and invade it with an army of about 500,000 men. This is called the Grand Army of the Empire. It says here on the screen it was around 600,000 soldiers, which ultimately it was with reinforcement, but it actually begins with about 500,000. His plan is simple. He's going to surround and annihilate the Russian army in less than a month, and ultimately he's going to take control of the country by taking control of Moscow, which was the capital at the time. Well, let's see how that went. Napoleon does get together this massive army, the likes of which Europe has never seen before. He invades Russia, and this is when he realizes that they're using a different strategy against him than most. Russia knows its army doesn't stand a chance against Napoleon. So rather than engage Napoleon in battle, what they do is they keep pulling backward, drawing Napoleon further and further into the country. And as they're moving backward, they're destroying all the food and shelter in the path of Napoleon's army, realizing that he's going to have to live off the land because he's not going to be able to get steady supplies from France into Russia. By depriving him of all the shelter and food in the area, they are weakening his army and they're drawing him further and further into Russia. This policy or this strategy used by the Russians against Napoleon is called scorched earth. It's literally called that because you're literally burning a massive miles wide path through Russia and depriving Napoleon of all the things he would need to live off of and his army would need to live off of as they advance. Napoleon does eventually make his way to Moscow. When he arrives at Moscow, he is excited because he finally believes he's going to be able to win, and that is not what happens. He arrives in mid September of 1812. He found the entire city abandoned. There was no one there. And magically, somehow, that same day he took control of Moscow and occupied it, a massive fire broke out in the city and burned much of the city to the ground, leaving it in ruins. The Russians, obviously responsible for the burning and abandonment of Moscow, they brought Napoleon into the city. They didn't have an army there to meet him, and then once he was installed in the city, they burned it to the ground. So the Russians are fighting with their minds, not so much with their soldiers. The Russians will continue retreating eastward from Napoleon's advance out of Moscow, and by the time winter comes, the cold and the snow of Russia has set in. Russian winter is not like regular winter. Russian winter is extremely cold, it's extremely frigid, there are high winds, there are blizzard-like conditions, there's massive amounts of snow. Well, remember, Napoleon thought he was only going to be there for about a month, and he launched his invasion in the summer. Well, now it's winter, and he's still in Russia, and he doesn't have the necessary supplies, and his men begin to drop like flies. They just don't have the food or resources to sustain themselves. At a certain point, Napoleon realizes his dream of conquering Russia has got to be suspended. And he turns his army around, and they are going to limp their way back into French territory to get food and other supplies. By the time Napoleon has gotten back to French territory, that army of 500 and eventually 600,000 soldiers has now down to 160,000 men. 160,000 men out of the original 500? The disaster in Russia cannot be overstated on its impact to Napoleon. He lost his veteran troops. He lost his trained assets. He lost this kind of veil of invincibility that he had after having scored victory after victory after victory. And Napoleon is coming out of Russia decimated, really, by all of the Russian winter and the Russian strategy. So his invasion of Russia fails, and in the process, in essence, he loses his veteran army. Napoleon is going to run back to Paris, and he's going to try to regather an army. He's going to institute a draft. He's going to bring more people into the military, but he doesn't have time to train them properly like he did with the rest of his army. And this is an army that doesn't have a lot of experience. Ultimately, in October of 1813, he is going to come to grips with coalition forces and Russian forces that for the first time outnumber him. They have 320,000 soldiers, again, veterans of these coalition wars, and Napoleon has a fresh army of just about 100,000 men who have no real experience. Not surprisingly, at the Battle of Leipzig, after 9 hours of assaults, the French are going to be pushed back, and ultimately they are going to be trapped when a overzealous corporal blows up the only bridge they had over the Elbe River and their only means of escape. So 30,000 French troops are trapped in Leipzig, and the rest are on the other side of the river trying to retreat. Ultimately, after the Battle of Leipzig, they have to decide what are they going to do with Napoleon. He has surrendered. He surrendered his army. The great conqueror has come to meet his fate, and they have to decide what to do with him. What they should do with him is clear. As long as Napoleon is alive, as long as he is such a popular figure with the French people, as long as he has the loyalty of his army, which Napoleon had a great ability to inspire loyalty to him amongst his men, as long as all those things exist, Napoleon is still a threat to the other countries of Europe. They should have executed him. But instead, they decide they're going to exile him to a small Mediterranean island called Elba. Elba is 60 miles in circumference. It has a population of 12,000 people, and Elba literally means land of exile in Italian. April 12th of 1814, he gets sent into exile. He's going to be sentenced to live out the rest of his life as the sovereign of the island of Elba, with a yearly income of 2 million francs, or francs rather. He's allowed to retain his title of emperor, and members of the Bonaparte family were also promised pensions. So when the coalition forces finally had Napoleon under their grasp, not only do they not execute him, but they allow him the honor of maintaining his title, maintaining an income, and they give him rule over this island of Elba. You can imagine Napoleon. Napoleon is the conqueror of Europe. He has been in control of the vast majority of Europe since he came to power. And now he is the ruler of a small island of 12,000 people? That had to be discouraging. Having said that, he throws himself into the task of being the new ruler of Elba. He established his palace and other residences. He designed a new flag for the country. He completely reorganized the island's administration to reflect his idea of meritocracy. He extended roads. He improved fortifications. And ultimately, he is going to make great inroads or great improvements in the island of Elba during the time he is the exiled ruler of Elba. Unfortunately, this is when he receives news that the Empress Josephine, who he has divorced because she could not bear kids, but he always loved her, and it was the love of his life. And she was living basically in a palace of her own, supported by Napoleon. Napoleon is going to remarry, but he remarries to find someone who can have kids for him and produce an heir. He still loves Josephine. He receives word that Josephine has died at the age of 51 of pneumonia. And she had just asked Tsar Alexander of Russia if she would be allowed to join Napoleon in exile and live on Elba with Napoleon. But Napoleon, that permission is denied. And Napoleon is reading a journal one day from France, and that is when he reads that Josephine has died. He immediately throws the paper down, retreats to his room, locks the door, and for 2 days he sits in his bedroom, refusing to talk to anyone, refusing to allow anyone to come in and see him. Napoleon is eventually going to emerge from that room, but he's going to emerge as a broken man. He's in exile. The love of his life has died. And Napoleon actually tries to commit suicide. He did this because he didn't want to be an exiled ruler in this situation, and he took a poisonous pill that he had. Unfortunately, the pill was old, and it didn't have the potency needed to kill him. It only made him sick. So he is going to be on the island for 11 months. At the end of the 11 months, he's going to hatch a plan to escape the island. By now, it has become a regular feature of daily life on Elba for supply ships to come into the island and leave. They bring trade supplies, and that's one of the things keeping the economy of Elba running. He is going to sneak aboard one of the English ships, and it's going to sail him back to France undetected. When Napoleon arrives back in France, He is going to make a direct march to Paris. When the ruler of France, the now King Louis XVIII, when King Louis XVIII, who was not a great king as well, kind of a weak king like Louis was, Louis XVI, he immediately dispatches an army to go cut off Napoleon and capture Napoleon. This is a famous scene when the army finally catches up to Napoleon and the entire army is standing before him. And Napoleon looks at them and he says, "My brothers, I have fought alongside you. I have had the honor of commanding you before, and I ask for the honor of commanding you once again." At that point, this French army that had been sent to capture him flips sides and joins Napoleon and marches with him the rest of the way to Paris, where King Louis XVIII has now fled and is leaving the city so he doesn't get caught, and eventually will leave the country so that he does not get caught. Napoleon walks right back into Paris. He walks right back into his palace, and on March 20th, he resumes his second term as emperor of the French throne, just about a year after he had lost the Battle of Leipzig and been exiled to the island of Elba. This is one of the greatest comeback stories in history. The period that follows his resumption of command of France is called the 100 Days. He's going to eventually try to rebuild his army, but by now, the public is tired of war. They're tired of the resources it's taking. They're tired of sending their sons off to serve in the military and die. And so he's going to have a lot bigger problem assembling a massive army. And so ultimately, he is able to assemble an army, but it's not a well-trained, it's not a veteran army like the one he lost in Russia. And so it's not what he would have had. Napoleon's 100 Days begins on March 20th of 1815, and it's going to last until July 8th of 1815. Napoleon is going to return to Paris, as I said, and he's going to cause King Louis the 18th to flee the country. And then he's going to resume trying to consolidate power in Europe again. In essence, he's going to try and reconquer Europe the way he had originally. This is not going to go well. The coalition army, who thought they were finally rid of Napoleon, is not happy that he's escaped Elba. And now they're putting together a massive army to hunt him down. They are going to meet. The army of France and the coalition army of other European countries are going to meet in June of 1815 at what becomes known as the Battle of Waterloo. This is one of the most famous battles in military history. Napoleon had defeated the Prussian army earlier in Belgium, and he and his army then expected they were going to win at Waterloo. Napoleon thinks his army's invincible still. This pride, again, is causing problems because he's put himself in a position where he can't back it up anymore. He can't win battles against superior numbers with inexperienced troops. He just can't. And so ultimately, he is going to engage the enemy. There had been a lot of rain, which had led to delays in Napoleon's opening attack. Ultimately, that delay allows the reconstituted Prussian army to show up to support the British troops. Napoleon is, in essence, surrounded. He's outnumbered. He ends up outmaneuvered. He's basically overwhelmed by the number of people he's fighting against, and his hopes of restoring his former empire are dashed. Arthur Wellesley, who is known as the Duke of Wellington, is the man in charge of this coalition army. He is going to defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. He has a quote that he says after having fought the Battle of Waterloo. He said, "I hope to God that I have fought my last battle. It is a bad thing to always be fighting." And that really could have applied to anyone speaking in Europe over the past, 100 years, basically. Europe is just tired of war. They're tired of fighting. And so the military commander bests Napoleon. Napoleon is once again captured, and they are forced to try and figure out what they're going to do with him. This time, they get smart, although not that smart. What should they have done with him here? Well, again, the answer is pretty obvious. They should have executed him. Instead, they are going to take him and move him to an island in the middle of nowhere, over 1,500 miles away from land. This island is the island of St. Helena. He's going to be exiled there, and it's in the South Atlantic Ocean, and it's beyond the reach of any supporters. It's beyond the reach of anyone that might help him. And ultimately, they are going to guard him with not only the natural geography of St. Helena, which has steep cliff faces, it's very hard to attack. They're going to put 2,800 soldiers on the island to guard one man, Napoleon. They are going to permanently establish a naval patrol of 11 ships that does nothing but sail around and around and around St. Helena to make sure that Napoleon does not escape again. Napoleon, he does try to escape. He has a series of escape plans that don't come to anything. They include boats, balloons. He even thought maybe about a submarine coming to rescue him. But ultimately, none of that is going to be consistent. He is going to spend the last 6 years of his life in exile on the island of St. Helena. One day he begins to suffer from abdominal pain and nausea. This continues for several weeks until Napoleon, the great conqueror of Europe, comes to an end, and Napoleon dies. They believe probably he had stomach cancer, and that is why he died in May of 1821. Now, his body remained remarkably well preserved, and he had elevated levels of arsenic in his blood and in surviving samples of his hair. So that kind of fueled a conspiracy theory that maybe he had been poisoned. Not a whole lot to support that. I'm not really sure that's the case. Regular cleaning supplies, everyday items back then contained arsenic. So it's no surprise that people's bodies had higher levels of arsenic than what we'd expect. Another conspiracy theory is that he never went to St. Helena, that he had been replaced by a look-alike guy named Francois Robert, who closely resembled Napoleon. And Napoleon himself grew a long beard, moved to Verona, Italy, and opened a small shop that sold eyeglasses to British travelers. And then Napoleon didn't actually die until 1823, when he was trying to sneak into the imperial palace to see his son, who was sitting as the king. By 1840, his body is going to be taken from St. Helena and returned to Paris, where it was interred in the Hospital des Invalides, which you'll remember is the place where the initial revolutionaries in the French Revolution went to get their guns to begin the revolution. The French general requested the tomb be engraved simply with Napoleon, but the governor refused and insisted that Bonaparte be added. So, as a result of the impasse, the tomb slab was left blank, neither saying Napoleon nor Napoleon Bonaparte. Today, you can actually visit the tomb of Napoleon the Conqueror, and if you ever get the chance, I highly recommend you do that. So what happens now that Napoleon is no longer in the picture for France? Well, the first restoration was again Louis XVIII, who was restored to the throne in 1814. The Hundred Days chased away Louis the XVIII and displaced again a Bourbon monarchy. The Second Restoration, after Waterloo, Louis the XVIII is once again going to be placed on the throne to rule as a French monarch in a constitutional monarchy in which the people co-ruled through a legislature with this person. Europe is at ease again because Europe knows that the greatest threat to the existence of these monarchs throughout Europe has been finally put to rest. And they don't have to stay awake at night anymore trying to figure out what are they going to do to prevent revolution from spreading to their countries. What are they going to do to stop Napoleon from taking over them and displacing them from the throne? All of that goes away with the death of Napoleon. Some people believe that the French Revolution, ended when Napoleon took over as the dictator, in essence, of France, and then eventually the Emperor of France. Other people believed that the French Revolution did not, in fact, end until the death of Napoleon, at which time monarchy was restored to France. So, either way, the French Revolution is 10 years of absolute chaos with massive highs and torturous lows. And in the end, we end up right back where we started with a king on the throne of France. Napoleon's impact cannot be overstated. This Napoleonic code left a legal legacy that has influenced, as I said, civil law systems worldwide. It is still the basis of 40 countries' legal systems today. His idea of creating efficient, centralized, professional governments with professional officials, not just nobles who come from the right family running the show, that is an idea that is going to take hold across governments in the future. And they are going to begin to run professional governments much like we have today. Napoleon is the model for that centralized bureaucratic administration of government. And then finally, he is the one who gave birth to the French national identity and pride. He is the one who gave France the confidence in themselves, the confidence in their country, the ability to see them conquering most of Europe. So his impact on France was great. His military genius cannot be denied. He just had a way of strategy. He loved artillery. He had the ability to see battlefields in the way that would allow him to put his army in the best possible situation and his enemy's army in the worst possible situation. His rule did shape modern European political boundaries. He's taken over all these countries, and now those countries have to be restored. And so they are going to have to create their own national identities and their own boundaries at that point. And Napoleon becomes a cultural icon. He's still today a subject of fascination in literature and art and popular culture. Aside from the Civil War, more has been written about Napoleon than any other subject in world history. So Napoleon's lasting effect, what he did, was definitely worthy of note. All right. So that's the story of Napoleon and Napoleonic France. Massive military conquest, complete reworking of the government and the legal system, restoring the French economy to goodness, providing French nationalism, punctuated by 2 exiles, one to Elba, one to St. Helena, and ultimately a disappointing end to someone who thought that he would be on the throne of Europe through the rest of his life. All right, thanks for listening. I hope you guys got some great notes out of this, and that is where we're going to stop for today.